Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Harvard Classics lectures over Walden. We are now in lecture 110. We are working with Walden chapter 11, Higher Laws. Although the term actually is not used this way in the chapter, it's more principles, but we'll get right into it here. Now, here we're going to see Thoreau as mystic, Thoreau as monk, and I think probably the most enigmatic lines, most challenging lines from Walden often here. It's a fascinating chapter because it brings both hunters and those who love to eat meat together with those who are vegetarians and vegans, and Thoreau seems to advocate for both, which is obviously a really bizarre position to hold. Now, we'll get into it. Now, the assumptions here for our lecture, just like always, are that you've been paying attention to our other lectures at LearnStrong.net in the Harvard Classics folder, lectures 99 through 109, as well as in our junior folder, where we've given a lot of other lectures as well on American thought, transcendentalism, and the like. The other assumption is that we're conscious of our three levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, messages, themes. At 2B, rhetorical understandings, not what Thoreau says, but how he says it, even down to simple things like length of line, as we pointed in earlier lectures, and the way in which, as Emerson said, Thoreau's stride when he walked is very much like the line that he wrote. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? Trust me, Thoreau's going to challenge any reader now at this point, and he's going to take a very clear epistemological fallibilist position at 3A. How can I relate this to other information that I already know, either from Walden or elsewhere? And then finally, and I think challengingly in this one, and as we've said, this is the culmination really of chapters 9 and 10 to finally come to chapter 11 here. And he's going to challenge us to ask the question at 3B, how can I relate to this stuff personally? There have been a number of people over the years who have read chapter 11 at the conclusion of the reading of chapter 9 and 10, and it has affected the very way they actually practice this thing called living their life. So we'll get into that. Finally, our assumptions are that you're familiar with our Big Five. That is to say, what does this text, chapter 11 of Walden, say about things like epistemology, what you can know? We're going to see Thoreau at his fallibilist best, Thoreau at his absolutist best as well, and maybe even at his relativist best as well here. As well, the second of our Big Five, ontologically, that is to say, who are we? I think that we're going to see a whole lot of this. Thoreau seems to suggest at times that he believes we're maybe not born human, that human is something we choose to be. We're born mammalian, we're born as any other kind of animal, but we choose to somehow overcome our animal nature, our animal instincts. Or does he suggest that we can do that or we can't do that? This is what I mean by the enigmatic character of this chapter. Of our Big Five, number 3 and 4 is psychology, sociology, the study of the individual versus the group. And I think that that tension is clearly visible in chapter 11. We'll get into it. And then finally, the question of theodicy, the question of pain, evil, suffering in the world, and why is it that it exists? We have said that Thoreau's mantra is, no longer as quiet as has happened to me, but rather for me. And I think we will again hear some of that here. Now again, Thoreau is clearly iconoclast here. Just like we've talked about Chaucer in other lectures, he's going to seriously challenge. Interestingly, he's going to quote Chaucer, or maybe we should say misquote Chaucer. We'll get to it, and we'll forgive Chaucer for his misquoting in the same way that we will forgive Keats in his Chapman's Homer for getting history a little bit wrong, and his references to Balboa instead of Cortez. But as that as it is, Thoreau is impossible in many ways from this chapter to categorize, and usually the only real way we can categorize him is to talk about him as an integralist. He's an integral thinker. We think of Ken Wilber when we mention him this way. For example, from this chapter, are we going to get the advice to let's hunt and to teach our children to hunt, or rather, let's become a vegetarian and never eat any kind of meat? Well, again, this is this wonderful contradiction standing, I think, behind this chapter. When I'm sometimes asked to just lecture this chapter, I have to say that really you got to remember Emerson's essay Self-Reliance. We've given full lecture on it at Learn Strong. You'll remember that he says a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, and I think that, this is the challenge here. Emerson will tell not just Thoreau, but all of us, say what you believe today, and then tomorrow completely contradict it. And it's pretty obvious that this is exactly what Thoreau will play the game with here. Now let's summarize quickly and then get on into the reading. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time, I hope, reading because Higher Laws just gives so much powerful prose poetry. First of all, Thoreau will begin in Higher Laws with this conflict between instincts. We have already said that reading Walden is in many ways like Odysseus and his men sailing between Scylla and Charybdis, and we talked about these pairs already. We've got two instincts, right, that seem to coexist within human beings. We obviously have the hunger, the longing for the wilderness, a desire to, he will say, seize and devour a woodchuck raw. And then the drive or the longing for some kind of a loftier spiritual life. Go back to our Plato lectures, especially Republic 6-7, and that notion of our two boxes. On the one side, the box that's physical. On the other side, the box that's metaphysical. And then, of course, from here, he's going to go to some very, real types of conversations about living one's life. He talks about hunting. He talks about fishing. Obviously, these activities take us into the woods, right? And they bring us with close connection to nature in the woods. He suggests that in the end, all men start out as hunters and fishermen at a certain stage of development. This notion of stages of development is going to, of course, be part of integral theory as well. And here, Thoreau will play that game. He says, however, most people never make it or advance beyond the stage of the hunter. He says, but if a man has, quote, the seeds of better life in him, end quote, then the evolution is possible to move beyond the nature of the animal or the mammal to the nature of the poet, the naturalist, the philosopher, we might say, right? And therefore, comprehend or appreciate or understand these higher laws, these higher truths, principles, we might say. Thoreau says that that it's been an interesting life for him. He says he's a really good fisherman, but he's kind of lost his desire to eat fish. But he does admit that if he had to live in the wilderness, he probably would be tempted to go back to the hunting and the fishing that is necessary. He says that humans can't deny either their animal or their spiritual insights and understandings, although he does seem to play the game of a certain kind of hierarchy that moves as we talk about in moral development from an egocentric to an ethnocentric to a world-centric moral view. And of course that idea will be very much a Thoreau idea as well. He discusses vegetarian diet, he discusses moderation in eating, in drinking, and even in sexual behaviors and chastity, right? He advocates accepting and somehow as well subordinating or living beyond your physical appetites, but not totally disregarding them. And finally, he comes back, and this is why I say that parts 9, 10, and 11 of the poem all kind of go together, because he ends chapter 11 with another reference to John Farmer sitting in his door on a September evening. And then all of a sudden, he has this amazing epiphany, we might say, to move from silly kind of ideas to consider practicing what he calls, quote, some new austerity, to let his mind descend into his body and redeem it, and treat himself with ever increasing. And the last word of this chapter is the word respect. And I think if you're going to do anything in regards to your reading of Walden, and there are many people who stop reading Walden if they've been reading it at this chapter, because they feel in some ways insulted, they feel confused, they feel like Thoreau is talking way out beyond himself. My mama used to call it the preacher had gone from preaching to meddling, and certainly we have some meddling going on here. But I think that last word, respect, and this has always been the mantra word of 303, it's not that we have to agree with each other. It's not that we even have to like each other, or even necessarily tolerate each other. It's that we must respect each other. That word, of course, will assume all of those previous words in some ways. I'll spend a bit of time now just reading the opening lines of Higher Laws, because in many ways it kind of continues with the previous two chapters. As I came home through the woods with my string of fish, and that'll be interesting because that word picture of a string of fish is very much like a string of pearls. In other words, you've got this line with all these fish on it, and in many ways that's a powerful word picture for what's going on in these chapters. And of course we're going to talk about fishing very literally in this chapter as well. Trailing my pole, it being now quite dark, I caught a glimpse of a woodchuck stealing across my path and felt a strange thrill of savage delight and was strongly tempted to seize and devour him raw. Not that I was hungry then, except for that wilderness which he represented. Once or twice, however, while I lived at the pond, I found myself ranging the woods like a half-starved hound with a strange abandonment, seeking some kind of venison that I might devour, and no morsel could have been too savage for me. The wildest scenes had become unaccountably familiar. I found in myself, and still find, an instinct toward a higher, or as it is named, spiritual life, as do most men, and another toward a primitive rank and savage one, and I reverence them both. We'll begin the poem, this chapter, with the word reverence. We'll end with the word respect. In other words, we must see the yin and the yang of our temperament. Of course, taking us back to Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, as well as William Blake's Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. He says, I love the wild not less than the good. The wildness and adventure that are in fishing still recommended to me. I like sometimes to take rank hold on life and spend my day more as the animals do. And of course, we can't read this without thinking of poets like Walt Whitman. I think I could turn and live with the animals. He says, perhaps I've owed to this employment into hunting. When quite young, my closest acquaintance with nature. And it's at this point now that Thoreau will begin to celebrate the fact that he was raised as a child to hunt. Because, of course, hunting, and we know this because of where we live and spend our time up on the hill and the Bighorns and elsewhere, we know all about this idea that when you're young, if you're taught well how to enjoy hunting and out in the wilderness, you learn so much about not just yourself, but nature as well, right? He says, when quite young, my closest acquaintance was with nature. They early introduce us to and detain us in scenery, with which otherwise at that age we should have little acquaintance. Walking through the woods as a 15-year-old with a rifle and hunting allows you to see the world of nature, he says. Fishermen, hunters, wood choppers, and others, spending their lives in the fields and woods in a peculiar sense a part of nature themselves, are often in a more favorable mood for observing her in the intervals of their pursuits than philosophers or poets even, who approach her with expectation. This is fascinating. He says, you know, you can be a philosopher and sit in the ivory tower, or you can go out and go for a walk with a rifle in your hand at the age of 15, 16 years old, and you might be more of a philosopher at age of 15, 16 for virtue of spending time in the wilderness, right? He says about nature, she is not afraid to exhibit herself to them. The traveler on the prairie is naturally a hunter, on the headwaters of the Missouri and Columbia a trapper, and at the Falls of St. Mary a fisherman. He who is only a traveler learns things at second hand and by the halves in his poor authority. We are most interested when science reports what those men already know, practically or instinctively, for that alone is a true, and then he uses the word, humanity, or account of human experience. A few lines later, he says it this way about humanity. He says, already a change is taking place owing not to an increased humanity, but to an increased scarcity of game. He's talking now about the fact that already larger numbers of people are hunting the woods. For perhaps the hunter is the greatest friend of the animals hunted, not excepting the humane society. It's an enigmatic line, and it carries with it all kinds of interesting implications. He says, moreover, when at the pond, I wish sometimes to add fish to my fare for variety, and I have actually fished from the same kind of necessity that the first fishers did. Whatever humanity I might conjure up against it was all fictitious, and concerned my philosophy more than my feelings. I speak of fishing only now, for I had long felt differently about fowling, and sold my gun before I went to the woods. Not that I am less humane than others, but I did not perceive that my feelings were much affected. I did not pity the fishes nor the worms. This was habit. He says, as for fowling during the last years that I carried a gun, my excuse was that I was studying ornithology and bird watching, and sought only new or rare birds. But I confess that I am now inclined to think that there's a finer way of studying ornithology than this. It requires so much closer attention to the habits of the birds that, if for that reason only, I've been willing to omit the gun. Notwithstanding the objection on the score of humanity, I'm compelled to doubt if equally valuable sports are ever substituted for these. And when some of my friends have asked me anxiously about their boys, whether they should let them hunt, I've answered yes, remembering that it was one of the best parts of my education. Make them hunters. Though sportsmen only at first, if possible, mighty hunters at last, so that they shall not find game large enough for them in this or any vegetable wilderness. Hunters as well as fishers of men, and of course quoting the lines from the Gospels. Thus far, he says, I'm of the opinion of Chaucer's none, who will say, Ye have not of the text pulled hen that saith that hunters be not holy men. Now we should point out that actually this is from the general prologue of Chaucer, and we've lectured this elsewhere at learnstrong.net. This is actually, of course, the monk from line 181. Chaucer got his quoting here wrong. It's not the nun, it's actually the monk. But be that as it may, we'll forgive him, right, the oversight. There is a period in the history of the individual, he says, as of the race, when the hunters are the best men, as the Algonquins call them, we cannot but pity the boy who has never fired a gun. He is no more humane, while his education has been sadly neglected. Now again, this is very controversial stuff for today. There are readers who stop reading at this point and say, this is absolute garbage. No child should ever learn to shoot a gun and to kill anything with that gun. Thoreau will beg differently, and yet, again, like we said, it's compelling complexities, enigmas that we're going to enjoy here. He says, this was my answer with respect to those youths who were bent on this pursuit, trusting that they would soon outgrow it. Now this is again the interesting view of Thoreau. Teach children how to hunt when they're young and they'll outgrow it when they get older. He says, no humane being, and notice he uses the difference between human and humane. Again, difference between maybe we would say mammalian and human. No humane being past the thoughtless age of boyhood will wantonly murder any creature which holds its life by the same tenure that he does. The hair in its extremity cries like a child. I warn you, mothers, that my sympathies do not always make the usual philanthropic distinctions. Such, he says, is oftenest the young man's introduction to the forest and the most original part of himself. He goes thither at first as a hunter and fisher, until at last, if he has the seeds of a better life in him, he distinguishes his proper objects as a poet or naturalist it may be, and leaves the gun and fishing pole behind. And then he says it, the mass of men are still and always young in this respect. So we're going to see here in Thoreau an evolutionary view of not just the physical development of the individual from young to old, but a spiritual evolution as well that will move from the eating of meat to the eating of non-meat. And again, he sees this as a spiritual evolution of a kind. A few lines later, he will talk about the ways in which the state tries to somehow control the whole idea of fishing and hunting. The governor and his council faintly remember the pond, for they went a-fishing there when they were boys. But now they're too old and dignified to go a-fishing, and so they know it no more forever. Yet, even they expect to go to heaven at last. If the legislature regards it, it's chiefly, talking about now Walden Pond, to regulate the number of hooks to be used there. But they know nothing about the hook of hooks with which to angle for the pond itself, impaling the legislature for a bait. Thus, even in civilized communities, the embryo man passes through the hunter stage of development. I have found repeatedly of late years, he says, that I cannot fish without falling a little in self-respect. I've tried it again and again. I have skill at it, and like many of my fellows, a certain instinct for it, which revives from time to time. But always when I have done, I feel that it would have been better if I had not fished. I think that I do not mistake. It's a faint intimation, yet so are the first streaks of morning. There is unquestionably this instinct in me which belongs to the lower orders of creation. Yet, with every year, I'm less a fisherman, though without more humanity or even wisdom. At present, I'm no fisherman at all. But I see that if I were to live in the wilderness, I should again be tempted to become a fisher and a hunter in earnest. This is again his epistemological fallibilism. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. Besides, there's something essentially unclean about this diet in all flesh, and I begin to see where housework commences and whence the endeavor which costs so much to wear a tidy and respectable appearance every day to keep the house sweet and free from all ill odors and sights. Now, it's at this point that you get the sense that Thoreau, more than almost anywhere else in Walden, is commenting on after his afterlife from Walden and after he's left, and he's looking back and he's trying to understand his life as a vegetarian. And his first comments are that there's something about killing something in your house and it's not as clean. And so Thoreau seems to have some desire to remain clean. Having been my own butcher and scullion and cook, as well as the gentleman for whom the dishes were served up, I can speak from an unusually complete experience. The practical objection to animal food in my case was its uncleanness. And besides, when I had caught and cleaned and cooked and eaten my fish, they seemed not to have fed me, essentially. It was insignificant and unnecessary and cost more than it came to. A little bread or a few potatoes would have done as well with less trouble and filth. Like many of my contemporaries, I had rarely for many years used animal food or tea or coffee, etc. Not so much because of any ill effects, which I had traced to them, as because they were not agreeable to my imagination. The repugnance to animal food is not the effect of experience, but is an instinct. It appeared more beautiful to live low and fare hard in many respects, and though I never did so, I went far enough to please my imagination. I believe that every man who's ever been earnest to preserve his higher or poetic faculties in the best condition has been particularly inclined to abstain from animal food and from much food of any kind. Well, this, of course, will remind us of some of the lines of Gandhi, right, who will say something very similar. He will talk about the larva state and the abdomen of men a few lines later. He says, whole nations are in the condition, nations without fancy or imagination, whose vast abdomens betray them. Thoreau does not like the idea that humans eat so much that they then become corpulent. He says, it's hard to provide and cook so simple and clean a diet as will not offend the imagination, but this, I think, is to be fed. When we feed the body, they should both sit down at the same table. Now, this notion of mindfulness when one eats is an idea that, of course, he learned from his studies of Buddhism, and he'll now share